creator of the BBS documentary. What I do in my spare time, which is legion, is I look into history, technical history. I collect technical data. I would find myself as some sort of archivist, bottom-feeding lobster type who goes around and collects everything that he can. And I'll talk a little bit about the philosophy behind why I do that later, after you do that. So, some would say that it was the greatest hacker convention of all time if they had heard the rough stats. Tens of thousands of attendees, a meeting area equivalent to 18 acres, and over 1 million exhibits on hand to choose from across the 3 months that it was in process. And in fact, that's exactly what Queen Victoria said in her own way when she said that this exposition was one of the greatest moments of our lives and likely ever to be. I'm speaking of an event that's called the Great Exposition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. This happened in 1851. It is not the first exposition. However, it is the first one that tried to get a much larger branding. The previous ones had mostly held themselves to particular countries. They were usually the province of royalty. And the idea behind an exposition was that the royal, or the baron, or the duke, whoever was in charge, would provide a venue, and then all the greatest creators of everything, the best artists, the best writers, the best industrialists could come forward with their products, and for anywhere from a week to multiple weeks, they could show off their wares to the populace. And this was basically a very large meet and greet in which you could find out for the first time. For instance, at the exposition, the safety pin had been created just 2 years earlier. So there was a wide, and of course, typewriters had not yet been invented. So there was a wide variety of items to learn at the exposition. So, before you're wondering how I'm going to go from Queen Victoria to dumping industrial dye into a pool in Las Vegas, the core issue in giving a talk like this is that I'm using two extremely weighty words, which is hacker and conference. You have a situation where you have these words that are now in incredibly great use, and while the problem bothered me earlier, the longer I've been studying this and the longer I've been working with it, the longer that I realize that it is not just an insurmountable problem, but it is not a new problem. And by new problem, I mean predating the concept of the hacker. So the game begins, and people love games, and the game becomes, well, what's a hacker? When's the first hacker? What represents a hacker? What makes a hacker? What's a conference? What makes it a real conference? What makes it a fake conference? What's good? What's bad? You know, what is the motivation behind it? So why is a hacker conference what it is, and what is one? And so you end up expending an awful lot of energy trying to figure out what is what. So first of all, I take it out of town, and I point instead to the past, before people even were using the phrase hacker. I had the opportunity to speak to the creator of Space War, and I just asked him point blank, did you consider yourself hackers? And he said no. At the time, we just said we were people who hacked, like we were hacking on something. So much as you might go for a walk, you're not a walker. That was what you did. You were hacking. It might give any kind of verb. So there's a period of time there when people are doing hacker-like things but don't call themselves hackers and certainly don't have black t-shirts. So to best give some idea, I usually go with metaphor. So if we go with metaphor, the closest thing that I have found similar to the hacker event is the flapper event. Now, flappers are now 80 years in the grave as far as popular culture is concerned, but still it's an image which kind of persists in kind of a modeled, sort of half-baked way. You have, double check something. Excellent. That'll be edited out in the final production, which will be for sale. No. Anyway, so flappers are a case, again, where you have a word that comes from an unusual location. As far as is known, flapper is a word that comes from British and is a reference to a young lady who is not quite ready to leave the nest, but yet makes an attempt to leave the nest and go out and party, but she's only flapping, she's only halfway out of the nest. Now, that is in the late 19th century, and then in the early 20th century, a number of books and a number of newspapers start occurring and using the phrase flapper to describe women who are partying, and more importantly, the idea of women partying. And then beyond that, coming up with an entire lingo that is supposedly used by flappers. So flappers have phrases like cakewalk, which is a kind of marriage, and handcuff is a wedding ring, and snuggle pup is a guy who likes to kiss but not go much further, and so on. You end up with these phrases and words that are interesting to anybody who's not doing it, and in fact, one can almost imagine that they're fashioning themselves inside that kind of a lifestyle. So, in a greater sense, the flapper concept is just a concept of freedom and self-expression and having fun and not taking things too seriously and aiming for just kind of a good time. So what you end up with there is an extremely, am I smiling enough? Good. An extremely interesting subculture or idea of a subculture that you're reading about and that you might want to do and that you can see yourself in, because the mirror is really so wide that you end up with just finding some part of it that can reflect in yourself. Now, setting aside flappers, there's another group, bikers, where you have an interesting situation, which is you have two sets of people and others who all insist on having the same name applied to themselves, but who would kill each other in the wild. Because the kind of people who would consider themselves a certain kind of biker, who would consider it a personal failure and goal to let their feet touch the ground on a 3-day trip, would not go very well with the person who has his bike brought out of its quiet little area and fixed up by somebody else so he can tool around on it. But on the other hand, you have a media that sees money in promoting the free, open lifestyle of the biker. So a lot of energy is spent where you have people saying, this kind of biker is this, that's this mirror that you wish to see yourself in, and yet this other biker that you'll see is also an extremely valid thing, and so please buy the t-shirt, both of you. Currently, there's a burst going on in biking for no apparent reason other than somebody made a really good documentary about them. But there's a really good burst now in biking and creating bikes and doing bikes and what are bikes about. And once again, that community, which had already had to deal with this, is now having to deal with it again, a greater and greater and greater pop culture hit until eventually everything's so modeled. So I see mirrors of these two events in hackers, in the idea of hackers. So the question becomes, well, what can you do? Or what is it? What are you saying? And I'm saying that when I hear the phrase hacker used now, I see it used by people who are professionals and people who think they're living a fun lifestyle. And the problem is that when you live a fun lifestyle, you're bothered that people are selling you because you perceive it as selling you. And then you have people who are professionals who are like, you're affecting my job because I make money off this. This is how I survive. So for one, it's kind of a hobby, and the other one is a job. But yet both kind of want to see a little bit of each other in it. The idea that, well, maybe one day my hobby will pay for me. I could make money at it if I get good enough. And then the other thing saying, well, no, I'm not like everybody else. I've not ruined what I was before by being what I am now. So in another metaphor, there's a situation that happened last year where a gentleman was developing some land in Perthshire in England, and he was about to knock down a large rock. They were going to put a park there and make some development over here. As they're about to knock over the rock, somebody comes running up and says, "Stop, you're going to kill the fairies." And so he stops, and he's like, "What are you talking about?" And they're like, this is the rock in which the fairies lie. And like anybody else, this went into his shit filter. But he gets calls now from the local government, from meetings that he's being called into where people are saying, no, no, you know, the fairies are a part of our legend that have been here forever, and this rock has meaning and has all this event behind it, and please don't destroy our heritage by killing our fairies. Ultimately, the rock wasn't moved. And in fact, the fairies were not killed. But sometimes what I've noticed, and again, this is just observational, is there's a lot of perception, and I felt it myself many years ago, of when people are to discuss what you are in any kind of an academic or studying statement, it feels really bad. And it feels bad because here's somebody who's coming in who's not you, who's telling you what you are, or at least feels like it. Because they're saying, well, when your subculture puts its definition of boy challenge wild man theory to rest, then we can find here that you are this sort of person. And then you're like, fuck you, because they're defining you. The reason I launched into this was because I was seeing a lot of noise, a lot of anger where people were saying, well, in our group, you know, it's very hard to reconcile a social group where you have a lock-picking, that's great. You have a lock-picking event, and then you have a full disclosure discussion. It's tough. It's a very wide open mirror. Now, jumping back, you say, well, first of all, thanks for taking me on that huge goat path, you bastard. But secondly, you say, okay, well, then what's your example of another possible hacker conference or something, please? Now, there's an event in 1936, actually 1871, my apologies. You know, they're so close to each other. There's this event called The Last Message of Samuel L. Morse, who created the telegraph. Telegraphs are very interesting things because at that time, the telegraph enables near instantaneous communication of thought across wide distances. Early tests are 20 miles, but eventually they girdle the globe. And certainly by 1871, when Samuel L. Morse was 80 years old, they had pervaded so greatly that they had changed the very nature of information. And in doing so, they built up an entire group of engineers and operators who fashioned themselves to operate all this large amount of equipment. It's sometimes easy to think back to telegraphs as just dit, 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 and on this side, dit, 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 and they stop the train from being robbed. But in point of fact, at that point, there are already automatic machines involved so that people are having issues with the fact that they learned this skill and it's being taken away. There are transmitters that can route so that when you hit this way, it goes to a router and it knocks out the 3 more directions so that you get it here and you get it in other locations simultaneously. In fact, by this point, it's being used for all manner of business transactions, communication, and so on. So Samuel L. Morse, by this point, had been recognized. Even he was one of several people working on this sort of technology, but he was recognized as the man, certainly in the United States and around the world in some manner, for the work that he had done coming up with this code and starting this whole industry out. So upon his 80th birthday, it was decided we will have an event where we will dedicate a statue to him in the park of Central Park in New York. And so if you can imagine, you have 1,000 people show up for this event on June 10th, 1871, where Samuel Morse doesn't attend the beginning events in the daytime because he wants to conserve his energy. So they have an event where everyone gives their speeches in Central Park, and a statue is dedicated to Samuel L. Morse, which stands there today. There is a trip that takes place around the harbor in a ship that has almost 1,000 people on it. And then that night, in one of the larger hotel ballrooms, where it is so large that 400 people are on the stage, much less in the audience, Samuel L. Morse is presented with messages talking about his life. And in fact, once they get the setup and then they get the relaying set up, messages begin to literally pour in around the globe, where after the initial, we're getting this right, as everyone got it right, messages come in going, hello, this is Singapore. Thank you, Mr. Morse, for all that you have done for us, signing off. Hello, Mr. Morse, this is England. So all around the world, all these people communicating, and all of them in their very own real way, network engineers, having a convention. In fact, having it virtually. And that's in 1871. Mr. Morse goes up and, as the big seminal event, has an assistant who types out a message of thank you and gratitude to the world, and at the end he's brought up to the machine which was the other telegraph device on the other end of the line when he sent the first message, and he types out his signature to a standing ovation. Now, if you have this event where you have network engineers brought from all over the world who are all meeting in a large city in a hotel where there is no doubt drinking and no doubt discussions about their nature of their craft, it's a great first. It's a great first of its own kind. And there's roots there. There's roots there because people want to meet. People want to get in place. And you want to add some weight to what you're discussing by being able to discuss stuff. And there is an industry that is rising up at the same time in hotels and in theaters and in arenas where they can have people meet, not on something that's assigned by the government, not on a play per se, but actually on for this night we wish to really celebrate this event. And such as with the Expos 20 years and over 100 years before that. Assembling human beings, assembling them so that they can talk, because the majesty and the magic of having people together talking is the core of the convention, of the conference, of the Expo. In 1936, there is a group of writers, 4 of them, who get on a train and take the long train ride from New York to Philadelphia and meet up with a couple other guys in a room. Now, this wouldn't actually be all that interesting if one of them wasn't L. Sprague de Camp and another one wasn't Isaac Asimov and so on. In fact, as far as they're concerned, it's the first science fiction convention. They got together, they talked about things, said this was a good idea, let's go do this next year. The next year they had another one, they went to Coney Island. And there's a beautiful photo of Isaac Asimov and all the gang, 20-year-old, strapping, happy guys, posing like goofs inside a large fake car for one of these photos where you pose like you're somewhere else than where you are. And then somebody says, we should have these more formally. In 1939, there is a convention held here in the United States called ConCon. Now, there's another one in England that is also organized a little bit of time before but takes place afterwards. So there's a fight over who has the first science fiction convention. The 75 years since then have dulled most people's perceptions or cares, but in point of fact, it's very likely that one started and the other one just got out the door quicker. So excellent, we win again. The science fiction convention becomes known as WorldCon. And WorldCon is a very interesting thing worth studying because it's a convention of science fiction people, which also has a semi-technical bent, which is more than willing to discuss many other things outside the world of science fiction and within it, which assembles tens of thousands of people that descend upon a hapless city or town. An event that is so huge, so large, that it has to be planned 3 or 4 years in advance, agreed upon, voted on. And in fact, towns compete. Groups of people say, we would like this convention here. Once that convention decides it's going to go someplace, there is an interesting process involved where the previous 3 cons pay money in as seed money for the newest con. Part of why there's an interest in having hospitality rooms asking people to come vote for their con. So at the 2005 World Convention, it was decided the 2007 World Convention would be in Japan. But one of the interesting things about that is that if you move it all around the world in this huge, massive, unbelievably large, I mean, even the first one had 3 presidents to take care of it, event, people say, well, I can do that. I can do that on a smaller scale. It just won't be so stupidly large. And I won't have to take 4 years to plan for it. In fact, I'll bet I could come up with my own thing if I just, assemble it. And so just by the pure love of science fiction and wanting to do their own thing, you have amateurs creating conventions for the purposes of assembling others like them without particularly a money angle or not particularly with a size angle, just here's my bent. And that's going on in the 30s and the 40s. Now, there's a 5-year period in WorldCon where they had to pause for World War II, but I can certainly understand. So up through the 50s and the 60s, there's another group of people, phone freaks. Kind of disturbed me, actually, coming here on the CNN. They had talking about phishing scams, and someone actually asked the person who was discussing it, so where does the PH come from? And she was like, I don't know, I'll have to get back to you. And he didn't know, and they didn't know. And it occurred to me that, great, I knew, but it wouldn't have made any matter to them anyway. Like nobody, it's interesting to me because there you have a case where a television media sounds like it's interested in something, when in point of fact it absolutely is not, and can't be. The nature of their stage, their performance, is that they can't go off on tangents of any depth, because that's just the nature of what they've created. And there's an interesting parallel with that, because by the end of the 18th century, 19th century, I wasn't there, I missed it, the media had an interesting problem because of the telegraph. You see, previously, like, they had a problem of getting the news out, just printing it. That was a big deal. But then they had a problem of influx. They ended up with telegraphs being able to give them news multiple times a day from around the world, where previously they could kind of sit on something for a week and get it out by Friday. And they could think along a week schedule, and it was a much more leisurely situation. And then what happens is that with the addition of the telegraph, now you know who died right now. And you got to get that out, or the other guy's going to get it out before you, and you're going to lose money because of that. And so now you got to have night shifts. You got to have guys up at night who are ready to give the next information out because you're going to fall behind. And so their problem is a sudden influx of a massive amount of news that they don't know how to deal with. We're seeing a parallel with that now, where we have this massive influx, which we didn't have before. This is caused, just like the result in the 20s and the 10s is the scandal sheet, a quickly produced newspaper with no actual facts, except for a vague kind of reference to things going on. Enormous amounts of lies, but very interesting. You have a situation now where you have a 24-hour news cycle, where literally you have to report what's going on right now at 2 in the morning, or the other guy is going to get you. And what happened in both cases is there's a drop in journalistic integrity. Journalistic integrity is ethics and integrity are, in many cases, a byproduct of entrenched parties. We're all here. We all know we're going to be here tomorrow. Let's just stop beating the crap out of each other and just work together as a team until another person comes in and says, ah, and then, Al Neuarth creates USA Today and everyone's, blown again. And that's the theory behind a disruptive technology, right? It's disruptive is because it's got the status quo. Someone comes along, bork, everyone's got to jump, jump, jump. And so what you're seeing right now in media is this kind of where they're saying, wow, whatever happened to journalistic integrity? And it's like, well, journalistic integrity was back when you could wait 2 hours before a story came out. Now you can't. You've got to get it out immediately. The story of these things are parallels, and this is you can't fall into the trap. It's never a parallel purely. It's never this and its previous shadow father. But you can see echoes of ideas that happen. And the key behind all of this, why do I even talk about this? Why are you here besides Kaminsky's talk is full, is, the echoes tell us problems, pitfalls, situations that occurred previously, that were dealt with, that were addressed. And then that knowledge was lost because after a while it wasn't needed. And by learning these things, we say, okay, there's a term, it's a term, something not unlike chronological ego, which says that the time that you're in is a special time that has never been like it was before, is the cusp of a revolution in which things will happen in which there is no perfect precedent to work on, and therefore you are deep in the void and about to, go to the moon. And the thing is that for most events, you can find these echoes. Somebody at least thought about it, talked about it. Computer ethics go back to the 40s. They were cyber ethics back then, but they were, the idea of well, we have all this technology and it can do these powerful things, and hopefully it won't be used to kill too many people. Oh well. But you have this idea of we should have this, and that's the idea of computer security. Now, at the time, it's more of a closed system, but then later it becomes a case of, wow, anyone can do this. That's even scarier. We're really out there. And among the most big, monolithic, largest electronic projects to ever come of anything is the telephone network, which is, by most standards, one of the largest computers to have ever existed, where automatic switching systems, which come into prominence in the 40s, allowing area codes, end up having to communicate with each other in a way not unlike a large networked computer, so that your phone call goes from here to there without talking to a person. In doing so, a massive amount of engineering has been done to achieve this. A massive amount of learning, not just of things computer or things electronic, but also things of how do you move into a town and do this? How do you deal with moles? How do you deal with strikes? How do you deal with people being against the telephone? What can you shape it? You know, when you press the keys on a keypad on at least an earlier phone, because we're losing some of this knowledge, but if you pressed on a touch tone phone that wasn't a cellular phone, the amount of time you pressed had been analyzed by tens of thousands of test cases by Bell Labs many decades earlier to come up with what do human beings expect to press a button for. Every single aspect of the computer interface to this massive telephone computer had been analyzed. The reason I mention all this is because it's fucking fascinating to me and to a certain subgroup of people who are not in the know, who would love nothing more than to work for this telephone company, because it's the greatest place in the world where these magical things happen. And yet they're not, because they're kind of weird and they don't have the knowledge in other areas, or they haven't tried, or they're too young. So what you end up with is the idea of the freak who's into the phones, the phone freak, who not only discovers that there's telephone stuff, but that there's weird things in back corners. There's conferences that they've set up so that linemen can talk to each other. And there's these weird loop numbers where one person dials in, another person dials another number, and they're talking to each other, like a two-person conference, allowing anonymous conversation. This is used by pirate radio stations in the 60s as their call-in numbers. Just they'll wait on that line, and when the person calls, hi, and they don't have to tell you where they are, and you don't have to tell them where you are, and everyone's happy. So you have all these fascinating things going on. So it's natural that phone freaks would kind of want to pass information to each other. Why? Well, you go once again into the nature of people. Why do they want other people to know about the trick they learned? Especially if there's a risk that that trick will be ruined by too many people knowing, right? And once you know that you can press these two buttons on a soda machine and cause it to give this kind of code, and now you've got it, well, how long do you want to tell people before there's too many people who know and they change it and you've lost it? So there's a conflict inside to do that. You want to tell people, you don't want to tell people, but on the other hand, you want to tell it to the right people who'll understand. So you seek out people who you think are like you, and how do you do it? Well, various places. Now there's an organization that arises in 1961, which is based around computers, based around learning them and being able to operate them correctly and do work with them. And that organization is called DECUS, the Digital Equipment Corporation User Society. This is a group that met initially on an airfield in New Bedford, Massachusetts, that would discuss the upcoming PDP series and how to operate it. And over the years, grew to involve the VAX series and grew to involve other digital products, all up through the 70s, through the 80s. In the 90s, with the purchase of Compaq, by Compaq, basically, it became another group. But by then, it was so large, it was everywhere. I mean, and this idea is these people are meeting. Now, these are intense computer people who meet, who trade information, who know things. And I would be hard to come up with a way that this isn't in its own way a hacker conference. These intense technological people passing ideas, not all of which are germane, and many of which are perfectly germane and brilliant. Throughout the years at all these meetings where they meet once a year, many of them in charge of extremely important things, some of them just coming up. And so, for instance, a lot of software that we associate kind of universally, like Adventure or Hunt the Wampus or Zork, come from Deacon's meetings because people would trade tapes. And they would have copying parties. Now, the phone freaks, who also would meet at various technical groups or find each other, found a voice in both passed around conference numbers, and it can't be discounted how much conferencing affects the ability to pass information. Nothing's better than throwing 10 people together online for at least 20 minutes, and then it goes to shit. But you get a lot done in that 20 minutes. And so the phone freaks had their own convention in 1972, the Celebration of Change, which was held in Miami and also in New York, where people met. Now, this was run by a gentleman named Abbie Hoffman, who was known for being a revolutionary shit kicker, who got involved with an idea, less of a movement than an idea, called the Youth International Party. The Youth International Party being, we're going to be all these youth, and we're going to go and we're going to kick some ass. And so they had a house organ called the Youth International Party Line, YIPL. And YIPL was interesting because it proposed to people, you can have fun and take down the bad parts of the system by fucking with it all the time. Get free bread, get free drinks, travel on the government's dime, do these things. Very much a case of let's fix the system by fucking with the system. And in it, he surrounded himself with a number of people who were technically adept, who saw, at least in some way, some similar feelings in him, although not entirely. And in fact, one of them, Al Bell, what is his name, decided that this whole YIPL thing wasn't working out, that it was misleading. And what he really wanted to do was talk about technology. So he renamed it to the Technological Assistance Program, TAP, which produced issues on a regular basis about everything from how to freebase cocaine to how to modify telephones. So there was a conference, like many conferences. The first one was rather small, a few people. A few agents showed up, causing great distress. There were bell-shaped cookies passed around. There were discussions about telephones, and it was rather short. Now, the second one got press. Got press on two different ways. First of all, there was a small group of people in Hammersmith, London, who got busted at a phone freak convention that was 10 people being held in an apartment in London, and they had a whole bunch of weird old equipment, which got pictures taken of it. So suddenly there was this little media interest. And so when TAP announced that there's going to be a phone freak convention in New York City at the Diplomat Hotel in 1973, over 600 people show up. They have stations set up corners of this ballroom where you can go for different workshops throughout the day. In the center, they had a number of devices, telephone equipment, that would generate tones. And at this event, in fact, was the announcement of this great new idea called a red box, where they figured out they could take this and be able to send out the information on what the phone was going, the in-band signaling for putting in tones into a payphone. That's a very poorly worded phrase of it, isn't it? The red box is a box device which doesn't work the same way it used to, where you could emulate a payphone by sending the signals that were going down the line when you put money into it. That's a much better description. And this was announced in 1973. So I get kind of edgy when I see people talking about great new red box articles in 2006. This event also had agents at it, but this time they were welcomed. Rochester telephone agents showed up, and a petition was passed around to give to them to ask that they be given overtime for the time that they were there. There were media, and masks were handed out at the door. Now, there was a documentary with Kevin Mitnick, Captain Crunch, and Wozniak where they talk about it, and there's a few seconds of footage because they used 16mm cameras and actually filmed part of it. And it's people in masks walking around looking at old equipment and talking about things. And some people came in fright wigs and masks so that they wouldn't be seen going in and out. You know, this strong sense of the telephone company could get us at any time. This idea of like we're this small group of people who are smart, who have interesting ideas, and we should assemble and we should come up with ideas, but the man is going to crush us, so we got to be a little bit careful. We got to wear some wigs, they'll never find us then. And they have this meeting. And I'm, again, hard for me not to say this isn't a hacker conference in some way in 1973. In the mid-'70s, without going into that too much, there's also Usenix, which is another organization dedicated to administrating computers, mostly based around Unix, which has continued in some form to the present day, and also involves conferences, conventions held worldwide, where people can meet, talk about things, trade information. And that's going on. And the thing is one can go, is that a hacker convention? And then that falls into what is your perception of what is a hacker, what is legal, what is not legal, what is this, what is that. And so, again, if it's not already clear, my theme is that I include all of these as hacker conventions. They all have the same sense. There's a sense there that's far beyond the term hacker, which will fade like the word flapper, which will fade from using 0 day as a word, just like we still use the word dumbbell to mean a dumb person, which is flapper language, but we no longer use dumb Dora, which is a dumb girl. For whatever reason, one got popular, one didn't. And by now, dumbbell has no connotation whatsoever, and then it did. In the same way that 0 day, which has some root in computers in 1980s, being involved in the trading of pirated software, is slowly been moved around until eventually it's now a engineering and security term. And in fact is a flag used by security companies to tell people, you have a 0 day problem. We've sprayed, we've done our best, but you're infested with 0 day. With the mid-1980s, with the introduction of home computers, you have a, yes?
I don't actually know when you said the 0 day came from the 1980s.
Yes.
I actually know that. Where does that come from?
Sure. And sure. There's two separate disparate home computing groups, kind of. Apple's and Commodores. Yes, there's IBM's, but I'm saying that there's a very strong, especially because IBM allowed itself to be cloned and had a situation where there were lots of workalikes. There were different types, but there's a very strong emotional sense around Apple computers that persists to this day, and the same thing with Commodore computers. In the Apple scene, there, and I'm sure another one happened in Commodore, but I know it from Apple. Basically, you would trade software, and you could trade software online. And there was a great pride in how fast you got it out. In fact, it was much cooler if you could release Karateka a month before they released it. And so if you couldn't, the next best thing to do was to either shoplift or borrow or work at a place and be able to take a copy of the software, copy it out, and get it out within a day. So you had a one-day wear. And you could produce it within 2 or 3 days. And the thing is that there became kind of a competition in which you said, well, we only accept 3-day wares. After that, we just delete them off the drive. We don't have any time for that crap. We want the new one to come out right now. And over time, the promise is, well, I'm going to have it in 1 day. I can have it in 0 days. If it's not 0 day, we don't want it. Like any other term used by teenagers, it goes through immediate, fast corruption. So sometimes 0 day just means the first time it's available anywhere. So it might be 30 days before it's released, but it's still 0 day because nobody knew about it before Monday and it's still Tuesday. But by Wednesday, it's old shit. So that's kind of where that is. And there's a group of people who are now in their 30s who grew up there and who were very young teenagers back then. And there are terms that they used in files describing them where a later generation of kids in the 90s picked them up and said, just like, not to be pithy, but just as like a later civilization might pick up an old bowl and go, wow, I guess they used this as a hat. The later generations looked at it as there must have been some great skill set shown in how fast we can modify this language so that we use zeros instead of O's and ones instead of I's, and we can actually work really hard and make the words completely incomprehensible. So that's not everyone's motivation, but there's a very strong sense in the files of this reference to these younger kids and saying, okay, this is pretty funny. Now, again, that was happening in the 1880s, around the time that OK comes into work. OK is an abbreviation of All Correct, OLLKORRECT, All Correct, like everything is correct. because there was a competition, a funny trend right around that time when all these newspapers thought it was really funny to misspell words. And they were coming up with really funny terms, saying da-da-da-da. So that's totally on the okay, and you had to kind of keep reading that newspaper to keep up with their lingo, or you'd be lost. So it was another attempt to sell the paper. This is some time back, I'm sorry. Anyway, so that was going on with that. So you have somewhat similar situations with that. So anyway, so 0 day does have that interesting move. Now, I don't see anything wrong with using 0 day to integrate bugs and used by network security, but it's not the same thing. I mean, it was left by one group and another group picked it up. Never the twain shall meet. Some people might be in some, but it's just lingo. It's etymology, which is one of the most dismal sciences around, because you end up having to go through and go, well, when I pick up this little piece of nugget out of the shit, I see that this person said it this way, but I go back here, this is this way. And you end up playing this game like people are very predictable beings, that once one person used it, it spread like this, and then the next person used it, and it spread like this, and it's never like that. But it's good to get hints that things have a echo. That was an interesting explanation of 0 day. So in the 1980s, with these groups of home computer users, naturally you want to copy software because you've already spent all the money on the computer. And you don't want to spend it. You've bought the car, why should I pay for the gas? So you have people copying. Now the problem with copying at that time, which is becoming harder and harder for people to fathom in a world where you have USB chains, you had to take an hour or two to transfer one piece of software. One 143K floppy off of a Apple II could take you an hour. So it behooved you to meet in person and do the copying right there, especially if one kid had the 2 drives so that it could go really quickly. So you'd have little get-togethers. Now these were all informal. However, in Europe, with the Commodore 64, groups started to arise who would be able to crack a program so it could be reduced so that it could be copied. And they had names, they had styles. Razor 1911 is from 1986. They were a group of guys. They used to be called, they had another name and then renamed themselves to Razor 777 to make fun of groups that called themselves 666. And they changed 1191 because I believe it's either the octal or the hex, I forget. Somebody here just went, octal. But that's where that comes from. All these groups started to say, well, we're copying software, and we're so good at it, we'll put our name on it. So not only will we put our name on it, but we'll put our name on with style. We will make these title screens incredible. You'll say, my God, look at that title screen, and then you'll play the game. So it's literally, hey, this ware was brought to you by the Pirates Guild. And sometimes they would include bulletin board system numbers, which sounds hysterically stupid, but at the time it made sense. You know, here's how people can call me. Well, they were trading by mail. It was just easier to do that. But then eventually, one of the groups, TRS was one of them, Crusaders was another one, which is, we should have a party. Let's just have a party, and we should all get together, 15, 20 of us, and just copy wares as fast as we can. Now, in the previous days, we called those users groups. But the software copying party was initially kind of, you knew everybody. But then, in these crack screens, they would actually announce where the party was going to be held. Here's a pirated ware, now come to this school on April, and we're going to have a big party. And that starts in 1986, and they're called copy parties. And first one was held in a gymnasium in a school. That's recorded, the invite, so the open invitation one. And it's attended by roughly 40 kids. But within a short time, certainly within a few months, there's already copy parties that are in attendance greater than 400, 500, 600 people. And then, again, these groups would produce these demonstrations, these ideas of these like title screens, and then they would kind of say ours is better because not only can we crack it, but we can make it look better. And at the same time, these copying parties get big enough that they start getting busted. They start having cops show up. So after a while, they just call them parties. Well, we just drink. There's some computers in the corner, but we're not really a party. Then, by the late 80s, they're called the party or our party with no indication of what they are, and they start having competitions for who came out with the best graphic opening. And in fact, the groups end up having to outsource. They end up having to hire specific people to do nothing but these graphic intros to make the others look good. And there's competitions, and there's money involved. After a while, they're actually offering systems. They're offering money. So you end up with a party in which there are demos of this stuff, and they're called demo parties. These demo parties tend to be between 300 and 400 kids until eventually there's a little fight in 1992, actually 1991, where the Crusaders are very angry because the group that's organizing the party entered a competition. They're like, fuck you, in whatever language that they were speaking, and said basically, you can't enter it because you're the organizers. That's ethically wrong. So they pull it. They pull the entry, and people are angry. And then these same guys also say, but also, you can't supply this way because that biases people. And eventually people are like, fuck you, start your own goddamn con. So they do. And they start to plan it in 91, and they don't get their act together until 1992. They plan for 600 people to show up. They call it the Gathering, and 1,200 do. And every year it's been more, until now 5,000 to 6,000 people show up in an arena. This gathering at gathering.org continues to this day. Same year, another group of people say that's a good idea, and they create Assembly. And Assembly is now so large, it actually rents out a stadium and has an average of 5,000 computers online in the floor. So literally there are thousands and thousands of kids with computers all meeting in one spot to work for 3 straight days. It's considered a very important thing to not only get really drunk, but not to go to sleep for those 3 days and be at your computer. And so these demo parties have now grown into full-fledged hacker conferences in many ways. There's another conference that occurs in 1984, started by a group called the CC, the Chaos Computer Club, the Chaos Communications Congress, which is a meeting of hackers. If you look at the first program discusses hacker-like topics, hacker-like concerns. They've been going now for 23 years. So some people are not inclined to think of this stuff as hacker conferences. A lot of that tends to be because, first of all, they're not always in English, and second of all, they don't tend to have house organs. And a small party of 20 people that did have a house organ was ConCon. That's 1986. And they are 20 people in a field which, as I said, hundreds of people have met previously discussing technical topics in all variety of legal and illegal at meetings that were planned and not planned and busted and not busted. But ConCon has 20 people who have a house organ and are, within a month, multiple members are busted and arrested for associated hacking defenses, and their magazine, affiliated with some of the members who have applied it, FRAC, reports this bust. And in fact, they go on to have another party 2 weeks later called PartyCon. So already you have a situation of a con that's designed to do nothing but have lots and lots of fun. Now, PartyCon is in fact a road trip by some of the St. Louis guys going into Chicago. Wow, he actually started to get to hacker conferences. And so even though there's precedence, you have a case now that you have this piece of media, this transferred piece of knowledge, that there's people meeting who are hackers and get together. So SummerCon, PartyCon, and then we start to see more and more quote unquote hacker get-togethers. We start to see things like PumpCon. We start to see things like DEF CON. The DEF CON starts in 1993, continues to the present day, and is extremely large. DEF CON was actually very smart because the organizer split off the concept into 2 locations so that you have Black Hat, which is the professional side, and you have DEF CON, which is the not quite so professional side. And so what you end up with there is that actually that move, which while it does cause some controversy because again you have this problem of the mirror, it also obviated the main issue. Currently a problem encountered in demo parties is that demo parties, because it's 5,000 people connected to a network, attracts gamers whose main interest in the party is to show up, be as loud as fucking possible, and blow shit up. They're not totally compatible with the other group who call themselves demo sceners, who are like, no, you have to be sitting here working on an assembly program to be able to make this thing look as cool as possible. You are not of us. We are not of you. You suck. In fact, I have recordings of a demo party where every time they have to show, because they have a large screen at the end of the stadium, which shows the demo being played, they have a song they play. They have sirens that go off and a song that means basically turn off your fucking game. And there's a chant because they'll do it. There'll be silence for a moment and you'll be hearing all these computers. And in the language, it's turn off fucking game, turn off the fucking game. These guys think The gamers think they're at the con for gaming. The demo sceners think they're there for the demos. But never the twain shall meet. So there's this endless conflict trying to grab onto the same place. So one of the things is the side effect of leaving things so open in my description of HackerCon is that there are, as a result, dozens and dozens and dozens going on now. Recon, Nauticon, CanSec West. And so what I've done is, and this is one, I mean, I guess you have to have in a newer style conference speech, you have to reveal something. You have to provide something you've been doing, some work, some piece, and say, here, go grab it. So I announce here for the first time hacker.textfiles.com. And what hacker.textfiles.com is a global, universal analysis of the concept of the hacker. Everything from what parties have been held to what papers have been written to different names that have been used, different press that has occurred over the years, what words people have used, and in what is probably one of the most boring things I've ever assigned myself onto, but which I will continue to do, I have been line by line analyzing hacker books. So books, and by hacker books, I don't mean TCP IP in 5 days. I mean Hacker Culture by Douglas Thomas, The Cyber Thief and the Samurai, Hacker Crackdown, Hackers, and so on. All these books, which are riddled with errors, absolutely riddled with errors. And many of them are, well, as one of them said to me, get a fucking life. But the concept is that people... No, it was not Clifford Stoll, it was Dan Verton. Actually, Dan Verton told me to get a fucking life. So he's next. And the problem is, people say, well, why do you care? And I say, well, because this is history. Right now, to come up with anything that I've told you about flappers, to tell you anything about these phone freak conventions, I had to go find mimeographed papers of newsletters that were hand laid out to be able to tell you, oh, there was this going on, and maybe my telling of it gives some life to it, but these are very small, tiny glimmers of views into things that occurred that were just like this, just as real as this, just as huge as this in terms of people involved and stuff, but they get lost, and what all we have left are the skeleton. The people are the meat, and the words are the skeleton. And without those skeletons being as accurate as we can make them, 100 years from now, somebody talks about how, John Draper invented the IBM PC and nobody's around to give a shit. But somebody back then looked back and said, no, I want this to be this way and this way to be this way. So I'm doing that now. So I guess in terms of a wrap-up, first of all, I apologize for jumping everywhere, but history jumps everywhere. It's not a strict narrative, and that's the first thing that you learn in history is, wow, a lot of forces worked in different ways at different speeds. And I hope that everyone here who goes to this conference and goes to many more will find in it things for themselves as opposed to things of what they think they're supposed to find for themselves. I hope that, in fact, when you travel to these different conferences, you realize that you have a 100-year history before you and that you have events that were just as important as this one that happened many years ago that you can be contributing to and making a difference in. And not to get hung up on, if I don't do it, nobody will. To do it on, I want to do this because it needs to be done and it's important to me. So, if that was a little too moralistic, I'm sorry. Anyway, so I guess that's it. If there are any questions about what I just said.
What influences have you seen in hackathons on other con cultures? I know, for example, like Hobbit has gone completely sci-fi con these days for the most part.
A lot of the things, well, keep in mind, right? I mean, conferences, and I have to be careful where I walk here, but conferences are small businesses. They have to be by their very nature. Some of them are a cart with a few tin pan stuff tied to the side saying, fresh fish. But some of them are endeavors in which a person could literally lose his life savings in 48 hours if he misplans. So, I mean, I have actually talked to professional con managers who have lost that amount of money and who have actually turned around and it was a Star Trek convention even. Who the fuck could you not make money off a Star Trek convention? But a few pointed plans, a few missed deadlines, a few missed ads, and suddenly they are on the hook. These are enormous liabilities. And so, to me, they influence each other simply because they all recognize each other as being all of the same organizational ilk, you know? Everyone who actually works on a car, even if they work on the car to work for it to race, to work on it to, as a profession, they'll find things together. So I think they influence each other simply because they all end up having to use, for instance, the fact that most of these hacker conventions are held in hotel conference rooms as opposed to tents, like What the Hack, or not What the Hack's outside, I think. A couple of them are outside, right? Some of them are outside.
Hacking at the End of the Universe.
Yeah, Hacking at the End of the Universe is also What the Hack, is also another one organized by HackTick.
Yes.
They change their name every 4 years, and in doing so screw up their branding, but are quite happy with it. And that's
CCC Summer Camp was the one that had the bivouac tents.
yeah. So you have a case there, but they're in the minority. Why do most people go with the con? Because they've noticed through the other cons what works best, and they say, well, what advantages do I have? When you look out for like what kind of conferencing services can I find, the best ones tend to be in the hotels because they've optimized themselves for that business, as opposed to, say, public campgrounds, which have not optimized themselves for business. And
we actually talked to each other.
yeah.
Just like any other small business association.
Right, small business association like this. So that's why. And the problem is there again, you get into that conflict, which is why I'm stepping a little weird, because people don't want to think that stuff they do that is part of them is being sold to them. And that permeates everything, because that's what people are. People are things that are providing things for other things, and in doing so wish to be able to at least breathe and eat and so on. So there's always that tension. So you have to be careful where you step, because if part of the ethics is you shouldn't make any money off this, then the person's like, you're trying to kill me. I discovered this during the making of my documentary, which I'm selling, in which I found that was one of the things, is people say, well, there's no reason anyone should be paying for this software. Another person is saying, you are killing my children. You are making them not be able to go to school. So that's part of the problem, and it is not specific to conventions. It is not specific to stores. It is not specific to trading companies or magazines or comic book writers or scientists or astronomers. Yes?
You had touched on some books that from this subculture may not have gotten the best accolades, like Cyberpunk or Takedown or whatever. Have you thought about taking all the data that you've collected, putting it into a book with more of a sociological versus journalistic?
Not to be overly elitist, but I don't see much point in me doing a book. Like, I'm not comfortable with that, because an electronic site that I can modify, I'm comfortable with. I work in that medium now. I am writing a book about being in the video game industry for 2 years, because all it is a narrative about what I observed in my area. It is not a book about what the video game industry was. And I'm not comfortable with that because I have too many projects in my plate, and I am not interested in dashing out my attempt to do something, right? It's much easier just to say, well, this is pretty accurate, but I'm finding this is wrong. For instance, hacker culture runs into a problem, not to beat up on Mr. Thomas, because he really does care, but his book, for instance, describes the Morris worm and uses it for a sociological context, the Marxian, blah, 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 which is fine, except he puts it on the wrong date. And he describes it as taking down the internet for a day or two, and it took down for 3 or 4 hours before they were already recovering and stopping it, and then trying to get stuff back, and then so on. So the reason why is because he never looked it up. Does the same thing with Mitnick. Gets a lot of Mitnick facts wrong because he uses Markov's book. And Markov's book doesn't tend to focus on that. The problem is that when you have a book where you have a thief, like in other words, what I said about flappers is based on relatively scant knowledge to somebody who is a flapper scholar. And the potential for me getting things wrong, going, oh, you used the Davis text, you totally got it wrong, is large. Because to me, it's not as important to talk about the flapper as an actual argument against when did it start, when did it stop, as it is to say, well, here's a parallel. And with hacker books, a lot of times it's like, well, the most important thing is, for instance, in the case of the cyber thief and the samurai, the most important thing in that case was to get the book out as soon after the trial as possible, because it was a potential to cash in on notoriety to go, look, a lot of people are looking in this direction. If I hold up this product while they're looking in that direction, I can make some money. And that pervades that book. So as a result, it has journalistic problems because it's trying to do the wrong thing. Similarly, the Markov progress, who is, not to beat up on Markov on recorded media, but Markov is a very good technical writer who, when he encounters certain things, goes overboard. And also had the problem of, a known problem, by the way, with the New York Times. The New York Times has a /dot problem, which is that if something goes on there, it is way blown up. Turns out, by the way, just as an example, I just happen to know this because of the Doogie Howser situation. There was a doctor, an Indian doctor. He's just gotten his PhD. He's 16 or something. This was like in 1992 or something. And it got enormous press, and everyone was there, and this poor kid was being interviewed by hundreds and hundreds of people because it had been on the front page of the New York Times below the fold. And the reason it was under the front page at all was because the person who wrote it had just joined the New York Times. And there was a tradition with the New York Times that your first or second story that you're assigned, you get on the front page. If it's deemed to be good in the paper, it's deemed to be put in the front page. It'll be shifted over so you can get in there. So what you're really seeing is you're seeing somebody's victory lap more than you're seeing an actual important story. And Markov got on the front page a lot and had his stuff written that way, such that, and I mean, I'm going to actually put up a lot of my biases as much as I can on hacker.textfiles.com, because the next question is, well, how many fucking axes does this guy have to grind? Because that's the natural question with journalists. If you piss a journalist off, the first thing they do is they aim all their journalistic stuff at you and go, well, what the hell is your story, and what can I do to you, and what are you about? And I happen to think that Mitnick was a troubled person who did bad things, who then had enormously horrible things done to him. Right. So he's basically, a turnstile jumper who got shot. That's a personal opinion based on what I saw. Nobody should spend, people don't really understand how bad solitary confinement is. And solitary confinement is horrible. This is why Mitnick went on the lam the second time when they came after him, because just not to ever be in solitary confinement, because you're not allowed to talk to anybody, you're not allowed to see anybody, you don't have any reading material. You are stuck in a cell for 8 months because the warden of Mitnick's jail thought that if he was given access to a phone, he could set off equipment and set off military equipment. And why did he think that? Because the New York Times indicated that he was an extremely dangerous cyber terrorist. So there's a case where somebody who would have, nobody now debates the meaning of Kevin Poulsen, right? Like they do with Kevin Mitnick, because Kevin Poulsen, while he was tried for espionage in a stupid move, on their part, he didn't do any espionage. He was never called a cyber terrorist on the front page of the New York Times. So there's a case where it actually had actual human response, a bad set of words. That was way too much polemic. I really apologize. So, all right, any other questions?
Where does the PH come from?
PH comes from the fact that originally in the 60s, the telephone was called a phone. I do not know, the phone is a word indicating audio transmission. It's got several Latin phrases. So in the 1800s, there were various types of phones created: gramophone, telephone, and other phones using media that now we have long ago dismissed in terms of they were called certain kinds of like emotion phones and stuff because that term was used. So when the telephone comes in, the telephone's called a telephone, T-L-E-P-H-O-N-E. And the phone freaks, to make fun of them, start calling them phones, but calling themselves freaks with a PH. So you get PH freaks, F-phone. A phone freak would always refer to a phone as an F-O-N-E in the 60s in the writings. So over time, phone, freak, free, feel free, any kind of alliteration of F starts getting the PH. And somebody who decided to talk about a scam where you were phishing for something put a PH in front of it, and that kind of got some traction in the media. So that's kind of where it comes from. But again, could be wrong. Could be wrong. I mean, once again, a lot of this is just a historian shining a flashlight down into a pit and going, that shines a little bit like this. Probably. Any other questions from the audience? All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. I'm available all the rest of the weekend to be yelled at.